Bismillah, we're going to begin a new chapter here, or I should say a new section of this chapter. After talking about invalidators of wudu, we're going to be looking at the things which require a ghusl, basically what obligates a ghusl. So first, let's talk a little bit about that. The word ghusl means to wash, okay, and it can refer to the water used in the process. We talked about that with wudu being the process and wudu being the water. Here, ghusl is the process, and also ghusl can be the water as well, depending on context of the situation. Legally, ghusl, it means to use tahur, water, to wash the entire body in a particular manner, which will be discussed when we get to that section of this chapter, description of wudu, etc. So basically this is kind of the idea, the concept of ghusl is found in the verse number 6 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says what means, and if you are in a state of janaba, then purify yourselves. Janaba here, janaba in kuntum junuban, if you are in a state of junub or janaba, then purify yourselves. Janaba in this verse refers to a state of major ritual impurity, which requires a ghusl to eliminate it. The word janaba is typically talking about major state of sexual impurity. Janaba, the word itself comes from jamb, which means to be away or distant or separate. And it could either refer to the prohibition to come to places of prayer when you're in such a state, so meaning you're distant and away from, or because sexual fluid has moved away from its origin, right? So either way, they both kind of work, so maybe they go hand in hand to give us a more comprehensive understanding of the actual word here, janaba. Look at the chapter. It says, Babul Ghusli. Imam Mansur al-Bahuti rahimahullah ta'ala says, يوجبه خروج مني بلذة ومن نائم مطلقة وإن انتقل ولم يخرج اغتسل له ولا يعاد بخروجه بعد بلا لذة والتغييب حشفة أصلية في فرج أصلي ولو دبرا أو من بهيمة أو ميت وإسلام كافر وموت وحيض ونفاس لا ولادة عارية عن دم. All right, start this off here. We're looking at ghusl. So ghusl is obligated by the following, and there are 6 basic things. The first of which is ejaculation of orgasmic fluid, and this is known as mani. It's important to note. We discussed this previously. So mani is the orgasmic fluid, and mevi is the pre-orgasmic fluid. Mani is considered tahir, pure. Mevi, as you know, is najis, is impure. So here we're talking about orgasmic fluid known as mani. It's discharged upon sexual climax and is typically very viscous with men and watery in women. So another note, this is occurring in both genders, male and female, both mevi and mani. Okay, it's not specific to one gender over the other. And the scholars, they mentioned the descriptions of both of these fluids. So it is discharge upon sexual climax due to sensual desire. So to require a ghusl, it must be due to climax. And this is based on the hadith of Ali radiallahu anhu, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, if you ejaculate here's water, make a ghusl. If it is not ejaculated, do not make ghusl. This was collected by Imam Ahmad. And so if it's discharged by an awake, alert, and sane person without sensual desire, the ghusl is not required. That basically means that many would have had to come out due to something else. So there might be an issue. There may be a medical issue of sorts happening here, and not a sensual, desirous scenario. So in this case, if many came out of the body without it being due to climax, it would be considered najasa and not legally many. If it looked like it, so basically that's what we're saying, is if it appeared to be many, and it came out because, for whatever reason besides being like ejaculated, orgasmic in nature, then it would be treated as najasa. We can go on and say that if someone were to have intercourse without reaching an orgasmic climax, they would make a ghusl due to the intercourse, but not due to this cause, which is ejaculation of orgasmic fluid, right? So they didn't ejaculate, basically, and so they're not making ghusl for that. They do have to make ghusl for the intercourse, all right? It's also a stipulation that it comes out of its normal place. If not, it's considered najasa. So ejaculation of orgasmic fluid requires ghusl as described above while awake or while sleeping without exception, be it due to climax or not. So being awake is due to climax. If you're sleeping, it doesn't matter. If orgasmic fluid is ejaculated, you have to make ghusl whether it was due to a climax or not. So if a pubescent person or someone that could possibly be pubescent, meaning they're at the age, they have yet to we've actually actualized and realized the signs of it, but it's very possible that they have reached that age or could be at that age. And this would be like a boy at the age of 10 and a girl at the age of 9, woke up and found dampness or wetness and moistness while their sleep was not preceded by a potential cause for sensuous desire. This is important. This is the condition here, okay? So they woke up from a sleep. Their sleep was not preceded by a potential cause of sensual desire. What is that? It's like looking at something sensual or desirous, thinking about it, foreplay, or the presence of an erection, for example, for a male. And they found it on their body or clothing and could not tell if it was many, then ghusl is required. Just as it is for someone who recognized the dampness as being many. Okay? So basically, someone that recognized it as being many, they have to make a ghusl. Someone who woke up from sleep and didn't recognize it, it was just dampness. They didn't know if it was many, but it was dampness. So long as it was not preceded, the sleep, by potential causes that I mentioned, they're also required to make ghusl. They are also required to wash what got on their body and clothing, meaning the person that was unable to determine the dampness of it being many or not. They have to wash the clothing as well, so they have to make ghusl, and they have to wash the body and the clothing if that's where it was. And this is done as a precautionary measure, and this is essentially from two angles. Either it's many, so they have to make ghusl, or it's medhi. Medhi is najis, so they have to wash the body and the clothes. So it's two angles of precautionary measure. Either it's actually many, the ghusl is required, or it's medhi, and therefore washing the body and the clothes is required, so they're going to do both. If a cause of sensual desire preceded their sleep, right? If they went to sleep, but before they slept, they were looking at something desirous, thinking about something, there was foreplay going on, or they had an erection or something of that nature, then ghusl is not required if they woke up and found dampness, because they're not able to be certain of a hadith here. In this case, however, what is apparent is that the dampness is medhi, and therefore it's najasa, and they have to wash the body and the clothes. Because prior to sleeping, they were thinking about things that would result in medhi. You know, that's the pre-orgasmic fluid, and that's typically what happens when you begin to think or look at or act in sensual and desirous ways. You produce medhi and not many. Many is produced through an orgasm. And so in this case, because they're not certain that a hadith occurred, but they do know there were things happening before sleep that could have likely produced this medhi. Then they will consider it as such because that's what's most obvious in this case. It's most likely what has happened, and therefore they don't have to make a ghusl, but they do have to wash their clothing. Complicated issue, perhaps, maybe, but it is an issue which shows an example of when the Hanabila give precedence over what appears obvious over their principle. And the principle was mentioned previously about, acting according to certainty, and that doubt doesn't remove certainty. And that in this scenario, we're not able to arrive to any real certainty. It's just an assumption of one. It's just what's apparent, what's zahir. Okay, and in this case, they give precedence to what's obvious or what's apparent over that principle. So when someone wakes up from a sleep not preceded by a potential cause of sensual desire, such as a look, thought, or foreplay or an erection, it appears obvious that the dampness is many. Right? This is what happens when you have what's called a wet dream. This is, it's not urine, it's not like it's water. That's not what's obvious. What obviously has happened is it's been many. It's a wet dream. If it was preceded by one of those causes, then it's likely that it's medhi, and therefore it's considered as such, and you act according to such things. And so here you're basically like breaking the principle with what's obvious, and there's no principle, by the way, in breaking the principle or in going against the principle. This is something that is determined on a case-by-case basis. In case you're thinking like, okay, well, we know the principle about certainty and doubt, so what's the principle now that undermines that principle? No, there's not one. There's not like a principle, then there's a principle, and that each is kind of eroding the other. No, this is like a case-by-case basis, and this is an example of when the Hanabila, they do that. Carrying on, it says, it is also required for excretion without discharge. Excretion should be noted here. It's what's intended here is an internal process without discharge, meaning the fluid doesn't come out. And basically this is the result of someone sensing preeminent ejaculation and either holding it back intentionally or it being held back in a natural way, like the body just prevents it from coming out for some reason. So if this is the case, ghusl is made because of the mere internal movement of the fluid. So this internal excretion, by the way, can also determine puberty. It can determine breaking of the fast if it was the result of kissing or foreplay or something, etc. And the requirement to sacrifice an animal during the Hajj, if it was the result of this type of fluid moving or being excreted even within the body. The same is the case for internal excretion of menstrual blood in determining puberty. So the moment that the young woman feels that the blood is now on the way out, even though it hasn't exited, then that's the moment of puberty. Okay, you don't have to wait until the end of her menstrual cycle. It's the moment that blood is noticed to be on the move. Here, it's the moment that discharged. This discharge is felt to be on the move. It is on the way out. Okay, so this requires the ghusl. So though ghusl is required for internal excretion, it is not repeated if that fluid, then apathetically discharges. And the same is the case for someone who performs ghusl due to intercourse, and either all or a remaining portion of the many apathetically comes out afterward, meaning it comes out not as a result of climax after the ghusl was done. It just comes out, meaning it's on the way out. You go make the ghusl, it hasn't come all the way out yet. After you've done a ghusl, later you find like, look, there's medhi present. There was no climax, nothing happened. It's just come out. It's just worked its way out of the body. Basically like it was on the road out and it just had to be worked out in a natural, apathetic kind of manner. So in that case, you don't make ghusl. But obviously, thinking about the invalidators of wudu, remember we said anything that comes out of a tract, whether it's impure or impure, requires wudu. So here, many has come out, it's invalidated your wudu. So that has to be done, not ghusl. The next cause is insertion without barrier of a real glans or its equivalent in the event that it is missing or has been severed. So the glans here is the male part of the genitalia, which is what would typically be under the foreskin that's been removed. All right, so this is like the tip portion of the man's penis. So if this is inserted entirely into a real sex organ, genuine sex organ, again, remember we're excluding the khunta al-mushkil, the undetermined hermaphrodite here, to a real sex organ, including an anus, sensually so or not, and regardless of discharge, meaning it's inserted and removed. Nothing happens, no climax, nothing. The fact, just the mere act of doing it has required a ghusl. And this is based on the hadith of Abu Hurairah, which states, if one of you sits between her four limbs and exerts her, ghusl is obligatory. Muttafaqun alayh. As well as the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, which the Prophet ﷺ said, when anyone sits amidst four limbs of the woman, and the circumcised parts touch each other, a ghusl becomes obligatory. This is reported by Imam Muslim. Now the scholars have concluded that what these two hadith refer to can only occur by way of penetration, insertion of that glans. Okay, ghusl is required for such penetration, even that of an animal, including a fish or bird, be they living or corpse, meaning any of these, anything, okay? Whether it's a human or an animal, be they living or be they deceased. Now, we're not talking about the ruling again of these acts in and of themselves. We're also talking about like inserting your penis into someone's anus or into a dead animal or person or any of that stuff there. They're not talking about the ruling of these acts. They're talking about ghusl in and of itself. So you shouldn't come to the conclusion to say that, well, hey, look, these things are justified in the Hanbali school because they're saying, look, you got to make ghusl for it. So obviously it's okay to do it because you're going to end up making ghusl. No, that's not the justification. This is just the manner in which the jurist approaches the subject matter. We're talking about ghusl. Let's think of all the scenarios in which a ghusl is obligatory, not the related rulings of those scenarios. Okay? So that's important to keep in mind. So if the man is insane, unconscious, or asleep, and their glans enters the private, both, here we're talking about the man and the woman, must make ghusl. If a woman inserts a glans of the deceased or that of an animal inside her, she is obliged to make the ghusl and not, obviously, the deceased. And we're not talking about the animal making ghusl whatsoever. Okay? And it's another thing to keep in mind that these rules about inserting the glands into a sex organ, this applies to males aged 10 and above and females aged 9 and above. Not below that. I'm not talking about younger kids. All right. So in the event that were to happen, age 10 and above for males, 9 and above for females, then they would be obliged to make a ghusl. Okay, ghusl is not obligatory for inserting only part of the glands, doing so with a barrier, or touching the privates without intercourse, meaning that they were just touching there. Because this is not considered insertion. So now we're talking about this specific category of the ghusl, insertion. This is not, so basically, we're in insertion here, he's trying to exclude ideas that may come into one's mind. What if it's a partial insertion, or what if there's a barrier and it's inserted a little bit with a barrier? No. Or if the privates are just touching together without any, no, this is not a part of this category. So ghusl is also obliged, this is the next part here. Ghusl is also obliged due to the non-believer's acceptance of Islam, and this includes an apostate who returns to faith, be they pubescent or mumayyiz. Okay, remember we talked about mumayyiz being between 7 and puberty. Also death, and ghusl due to death is purely devotional, and it's not because death is a hadith that occurs. And it's applicable regardless of age, meaning the ghusl, so long as they are neither martyr nor wrongfully killed. In that event, it's not obliged. They're not obliged to make the ghusl for them. It's also obliged due to menstruation, which is based on the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, who told Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh, told her to give up the prayers when the menses begins, and when it has finished, make ghusl and start praying. Muttafaqun alayh. Also due to postpartum bleeding, but not a bloodless delivery, which does not prohibit intercourse or invalidate fasting, meaning the bloodless delivery. Imam al-Bahuti goes on, he says, وَمَنْ لَزِمَهُ غُسْلٌ حَرُمَ عَلَيْهِ قِرَاءَةُ آيَةٍ فَأَكْثَرُ وَلُبْثٌ بِمَسْجِدٍ بِلَا وُضُوءٍ وَلَهُ الْمُرُورُ بِهِ وَقَوْلُ مَا وَافَقَ قُرْآنًا وَلَمْ يَقْصِدْهُ كَالْبَسْمَلَةِ وَالْحَمْدَ لَهِ. Here we go with whoever is required to make ghusl due to any of the aforementioned reasons. The previously mentioned reasons is prohibited from reciting a verse in its entirety or more. This is based on the hadith that Ali said, the Prophet ﷺ was not prevented from the Quran by anything other than sexual impurity. It's been reported by Ibn Khuzaymah, Al-Hakim, and Darqutni. Or the recitation of a portion of a very long verse. So basically what we're saying is you can recite a portion of a verse so long as it is short, but reciting a portion of a very long verse is prohibited, like Ayatul Dain, which is the verse about the loan, and that's essentially an entire page in length. To do that, a portion of that, to recite half the page, that's not permitted. Whoever is required to make ghusl, even if their bleeding has stopped in the case of a woman who has completed her menstrual cycle, or postpartum bleeding has come to an end, it's prohibited from staying in the masjid. Right? Meaning anyone that is required to make a ghusl, even if it's a woman whose bleeding has stopped, the menstrual blood or postpartum bleeding has stopped, they're prohibited from staying in the masjid or the musalla of Eid without wudu. Basically, a person has to make wudu in order to stay there. And this is based on the verse number 43 in Surah An-Nisa, which states, basically what it means, "O you have believed, do not approach prayer while you are intoxicated until you know what you're saying, or in a state of janaba, except those passing through a place of prayer, until you have washed your body." You can refer back to verse number 43 in Surah An-Nisa. It's also based on the hadith which states, "I do not permit the masjid for the menstruating woman or person in a state of major sexual impurity." This was collected by Imam Abu Dawud. So to stay in the masjid in such a state of major ritual impurity, wudu is required. And this is based on the statement of al-Talib ibn Yasar. He said, "I saw a group of men from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ sitting in the masjid while junub, having made wudu like they would for prayer." This was collected by Sa'id ibn Mansur. So basically, wudu lessens the severity of a major hadith. Now, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, he said that it was also permissible to sleep in the masjid in such a state, meaning you were junub, but you made wudu. So now you can stay in the masjid. You require a ghusl, but you made wudu, so you can stay in the masjid, which his conclusion meant that you can also sleep in the masjid based on the fact that in a state of junub, you are required to make a ghusl, and you should do so before falling asleep. And if you are not going to do the ghusl, then you make wudu. So his conclusion is based on that here. So here you can see an example of how the Hanabila, they're going to use Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah's conclusions here, not to point out a difference of opinion, or not to draw your attention to his conclusions and basically say like he concluded that, but that's not the mu'tamid. Here they're using it as an additional benefit to this particular portion of the chapter. And this again highlights how the Hanabila, they work with Shaykh al-Islam and his conclusions, right? Mentioning them at times to highlight the fact that this isn't the mu'tamid, though it has been said by such an amazing person and scholar that we revere as Hanabila. And then at times saying, look, this is his conclusion, and so we're going to benefit from that, or this is his conclusion and it is in support of what the mu'tamid actually is. Passing through the masjid based on need or not need, it's permissible. And this, of course, is based on that previous verse, which states the portion says, except those passing through. So passing through the masjid while junub or requiring ghusl for a need would be like, look, If I pass through the masjid, it's like a quicker route. Instead of having to circumvent or whatever, to go around the masjid would be a lengthy, and if you've ever been to the Haram in Mecca, or you've been to the Prophet's Masjid in Medina, or some of these very large masjids, if you're trying to get from one part to the other part of the city, in order to do that, to go around the masjid, it may take you quite a long time, and you may need to be getting across the road, basically, through the masjid. That would be a need. Imam Ahmad considered this dislike, to make a roadway through the masjid type of a deal. However, it is permitted in such a state of major hadith. But for women that are passing through, even if they're on their menstrual cycle or experiencing their postpartum bleeding, what would allow them to do so, to pass through, is that they could assure that blood would not soil the location. He ends this section here saying, uttering a statement which unintentionally matches the Quran, like Bismillah or Alhamdulillah, or to say Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, or the dua said when you get in the car or you mount on an animal, Subhanalladhi sakhara lana hadha wa ma kunna lahu muqrinin inna ila rabbina lamunqalibun, which is a verse in the Quran. Even if you were to say that while not intending to be reciting a verse, then this is certainly permissible to do while in a state of major ritual impurity. Otherwise, it's not, because you're reciting the Quran, and we've talked about the requirement of ghusl for that in the event that you are in a state of major ritual impurity. And that will wrap up this section.